Welcome to the Lazare Herzi Podcast, a place where I talk to exceptional individuals who have found their flow. In this first season, I attempt to capture the mental processes of entrepreneurs and explain how they started movements that make them tap dance to work each day. This podcast is for students, entrepreneurs, and anybody in between the two. Welcome to the first episode of the Lazare Herzi Podcast. This episode features me, Lazare, and my guest, Aaron McDaniel, the professor of entrepreneurship at UC Berkeley. In this interview, we discuss startup accelerators, book writing, and the role of education in innovation. Before we jump into the interview, though, I want to give you a little more info on Professor McDaniel's professional experience. I first met Professor McDaniel when I took his class, Introduction to Entrepreneurship. This ended up being an inflection point in my life, causing me to switch out of my pre-med major to focus on business innovation. He taught me how to listen closely to the voice of my customers, how to validate a business idea, and how to work in a team cordially. I owe him a lot. In addition to being an important teacher in my life, Professor McDaniel walks the walk. He started off his career by working at AT&T, eventually leaving to start his own company to escape the rat race. Over the next 9 years, he created and sold 3 companies, Pong 360, Tycoon Real Estate, and Access Invest. He also wrote 2 books guiding young professionals on proper managerial techniques. And he gives back too by guiding dozens of student-run startups on their path to profitability. Not one to dawdle, he's now involved in a tech startup called IP Shark and a real estate private equity fund called Velocity Capital Group. So sit back, relax, and enjoy my chat with Aaron McDaniel.
Let's just jump right in. The first question, I wanted to start off by talking about your story. Can you walk me through your professional journey since college?
Sure. So I graduated from UC Berkeley's Law School of Business and had a really unique opportunity where I joined AT&T as part of their leadership development program. Mm-hmm. It was a rotational leadership program where basically day one they put you in charge of like 20 people, and in my case it was I think half of those people had been at the company longer than I'd been alive. But it was real cool in particular with this program because it was primarily for MBA graduates, but as an undergraduate, I was able to be given that opportunity. And so started there, worked in a number of different capacities, from managing a customer care center to doing marketing and project management for a local marketing team to when AT&T first launched Uverse television service. I managed a couple garages of technicians who were out there actually installing in people's houses. Then moved over and went into sales and actually became one of the youngest ever to serve as regional vice president of sales at AT&T, running an 8-state organization, and then moved over into business development and strategy and did that before transitioning to a full-time entrepreneurial career.
Mm-hmm. Something I actually wanted to talk about was that transition. And how did you kind of navigate that transition from corporate to entrepreneurship? What kind of questions were you asking yourself, and when did you know it was time to make a jump?
Yeah, I mean, I think it had been a long time coming for me. So while basically the entire time I was at AT&T, I had been doing a bunch of side ventures and almost in a way using the funding that I was getting from my employment at AT&T as a VC, as an investor to generate capital for me to do these side businesses. Some of them were some had some level of success. Some of them were utter failures. So I had a precursor app to Uber that was for taxi companies. That was just taxi companies weren't willing to change at that time, among other mistakes that were made. On the other end, started a portable beer pong table company, actually, that they got acquired a few years ago after we had built out the business. But I had known that, and I don't know if it was some message I'd heard growing up or just other external things I'd read, but I knew that the way to really build wealth and the way to get out of that rat race of paycheck to paycheck was to own your own business. And so I knew at the end of the day that I would be running my own businesses. That just sort of suited me, and it was something, the understanding that I knew in order for me to have the control of my professional life that I wanted, that it was important for me to do that. And despite very good things about my experience at AT&T, it became very clear that if you wanted to rise up in that company, when they said jump, you had to say how high. And when they said, we want you to do this position, wherever it may be, you had to do it. And if you said no a couple times to those opportunities, they stopped asking. And so I knew that was something that I wanted that control of my career. I knew that was the best way to build wealth. And it's interesting, just as a side, when my parents had offered a message of, go work for a company for a number of years and learn different things and then go start your own thing. And I think there's goods and bads to that. I mean, if you actually look at most entrepreneurs, the ones that are out there raising money and scaling businesses, they tend to be a little bit older. They tend to be in their late 30s and 40s. I know there's a lot of press that go to the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world that start companies when they're 20 years old, but that's not a majority. And so a lot of them, especially in B2B, business to business concepts, they're able to take that experience they had, see some real key problem, and create a solution to that problem that companies are willing to pay a lot for. But at the same time, when you go through that, you develop a lot of bad habits. When you work at companies, it
like what?
Well, I guess I'd put it this way. 1 year, I think it was the last full year that I had gone through and had my annual review at AT&T. I remember getting a very high exceeds expectation score, and the way AT&T works, it wasn't just anybody got it. It was sort of a bell curve. It was kind of hard to get that piece, but I look back and what happened that year, and I felt like I really hadn't contributed like I should have. And there were a lot of bureaucratic, obstacles that had been put up in what I had to do. But the idea that I didn't accomplish what I needed to, or maybe, didn't put in as big of an effort as I could have and still got that highest score, that just, that to me treats, or causes people to sort of get to this point where they're like, no matter how much effort I put in, if I put in that A effort, I'm still going to get the same result. So I might as well just sort of coast a little bit and put in, enough to get by. And so, that's just not me. And I don't like doing that. But I still saw after almost a decade at AT&T, that was a feeling that came over that I imagine happens with a lot of people. And along with that comes some other bad habits.
Something I think that's very important that you mentioned, you talked about a lot of people start in their 30s and mid 30s to 40s, and that causes some issues. And suddenly you're part of that crowd now. And when we were talking earlier, you talked about you have a kid now. I'm wondering, how has your propensity for risk changed since you've had your kid? Has it influenced the way you run businesses, the way you think about investment opportunities?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I'd actually seen prior to being married and having a kid that I had other business partners as we were starting ventures where when it became time for us to put some money in and time in, they kind of dropped off. And it was because of the fact that they had these other responsibilities. I mean, when you have a mortgage or a car payment or otherwise, I mean, it makes it harder to make those decisions. The other side, which I think is beneficial, especially for those that are under 50 or under 40 in particular, whereas older generations, a smaller portion of couples will dual income. For a lot of millennial and Gen X couples, it's both spouses work, and that allows for a little bit of this sort of give and take back and forth of one person can take more risks, one person can take more of an entrepreneurial route, and the other can have more of that steady job to pay for healthcare and have something more steady, and then there's an opportunity for those to switch as each spouse may get a chance to explore their passion or explore an opportunity in becoming an entrepreneur. So I think if it's a sole income, one spouse is paying for everything, working, then that makes it much harder. But there is a little bit more flexibility if both are.
Interesting. Are there any dedicated processes or checklists that you use to kind of screen new businesses or career opportunities?
Yeah. So first and foremost, I'm a big believer in this, I guess, the concept of the boats rise and fall with the level of the oceans.
I remember that.
In that if you pick a market that is growing fast and there's a lot of opportunity, you have a higher likelihood of being successful. If you're picking something that's declining or in particular, if you're attempting to create something that a market doesn't exist for, there are a lot more roadblocks. And I've been in spaces where I've been creating an idea that was sort of foreign to everyone, and I had to convince them and educate them on it. And that's much harder than taking an existing fast-growing industry, putting your own slant on it, solving the problem in a better way, and then sort of riding that tide.
That's definitely something I'm wondering about, because I see this yin-yang in your business style where you'll be in I think Jeff Bezos calls them pinwheels, very low asset, high cash flow startups. And then you're also involved in very asset heavy, like real estate investments. What have you learned that kind of transfers from one investment philosophy to the other? And can you just talk a little bit about your experience having a hand in both of those pots?
Sure. So you started to offer some insights into this. When you look at it, there are two different types of business at their core, and they're the ones that are cash flow businesses. That the business itself may not have a ton of resale value, maybe a small multiple above the asset that you have and existing customers. And then the other side is more of that venture model where you don't make a lot of cash, but you are building something, and the intention is to have an exit of being purchased or going initial public offering and delaying the profitability element. And so one side is more about cash flow, the other side is more about equity. And to tie into the reference of real estate, depending on the type of real estate, and the particular one that I focus on is multifamily, it's both, because you're able to generate cash flow from that asset, and then typically, as long as you buy in the right market that has right financial indicators and you're at the right part of the cycle, when you sell that, you then can make money on the equity side as well. And so that's part of the reason I like real estate, is because it's both. The other thing is, when you're working in a venture type business, it's like swinging for the fences, to use a baseball analogy. It's just, you're going for it. You may hit a home run or you may strike out. Whereas with real estate, even when things went absolutely crazy in 2008 and the market crashed, the value of the real estate never went down to zero. It's still a physical building. There's still a physical value there. So it's, in some respects, it can be a little less risky than other types of businesses.
That's something that also interests me concerning swing with the fences. How do you feel about the land of the living dead? And just to borrow a term, when a startup doesn't achieve the order of magnitude it was supposed to, but it's still a profitable business and it's still that kind of thing. Have you found yourself in such a situation, and what would you do if you did?
Yeah, so that's the interesting thing, and I think what the land of the living dead example you use is really the answer to that depends on who is answering the question. So if you look at a venture capitalist as an example, they care about that one crazy huge Facebook, Twitter, or Snapchat in their portfolio. They want that one to be 1,000x, and they'd rather focus on making that 1,001x or 1,005x than making every single one of the companies, in their portfolio successful. And so they sort of ignore those, because just to fund the model, it doesn't make sense, and they plan accordingly. They know that the majority of the time they're going to fail. But that doesn't mean that those companies don't have a value. That doesn't mean that they should be shut down. I mean, they still have customers, especially if they get to the level of how they are being profitable. It may not be a great thing in the eyes of that venture capitalist, but it may be in the eyes of those people who have jobs there, and to the customers that are benefiting. I think it's just finding the right exit so that they can continue to operate, or otherwise. I have a friend of mine as an example, and he purchases companies that are in that category for venture capitalists, and find ways to continue them on, whereas the venture capitalists may not be as focused on it.
It's very interesting. I know that you're a professor, and you also deal with very nascent startups before they've achieved this profitability. What proof of concept tools do you find yourself recommending often to entrepreneurs or Berkeley students when they have a business idea?
Yeah, so the difference between this type of startups 15, 20 years ago and today is that the barriers to entry are so much lower. It used to be difficult to build out a business, especially when it came to fundraising, especially when it came to, if you were doing a software business, as an example, you literally had to buy servers.
Wow.
If you had a physical product company, you would need to, in order to, you need a certain amount of money to put into inventory to pay for even like the mold that the factory uses to build it, and to have enough of a volume to meet the minimum of that factory. And so you just needed funds. And now there are a lot of other ways you can do that for less. You can start a Kickstarter or Indiegogo crowdfunding campaign and be able to get a bunch of pre-orders. You can use Amazon Web Services and pay by the penny or fraction of a penny instead of having to pay tens of thousands of dollars in equipment. And so because of that, the focus should be on traction. Like there's this extra element of not just the idea and the market and the team, but the actual traction that's been proven out, the actual results of customers saying they want this and being willing to pay for it. And so really the best thing to do as you're building out a business is to find ways to create that traction, to show that, go ahead.
Can you give us an example with maybe one of your businesses so people have a kind of a visualization of what traction would look like?
Sure. So on the side of one of the businesses I started was Access Invest, which was was basically the country's largest mobile aggregator of alternative investments. So there were, at the time I was building this a few years ago, crowdfunding platforms were just cropping up everywhere. There were literally hundreds of them. And it was very hard for any investor to be able to know what was going on with all of them, or if they went and signed up to all of them, they had to share a bunch of personal information, and then they had to, actually had to get bombarded with emails every day about it. So we said, let's put it in an app. Let's make it with a Tinder-like swiping interface. And then as investors swipe through these deals, we're able to learn what those investors are interested in, what they like, what they don't like, and give them more of the deals that they were interested in. So for us, we weren't charging the users of the app. But the fact that there were people who wanted to use the app and downloaded it and then were using it on a regular basis, that was validation. That was traction on one end. Now, because this was a two-sided marketplace example where there was a supply of deals and a supply and then demand from investors, there was another set of customers, which were how we were monetizing, which basically was charging the platforms who were sharing their deals. And so, in the case of that company, traction is, like I said, the number of users downloading and actively using the app, and then the number of platforms that are willing to sign up to share their deals, and then be able to, the model in our case was charge them for every interested investor we connected with them.
Very interesting. When you're in a startup, I feel like it's kind of tunnel vision. Do you find that your industry experience feeds into like Access Invest now? And when somebody comes to you for advice, not having this industry experience and just having the idea, how do you decide whether to steer them towards either, okay, maybe you should try a little bit of corporate life first, or, okay, let's start getting some traction right now? Or are barriers to entry low enough to just start validating ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I venture to say that when it comes to an entrepreneurial venture, being an entrepreneur, it's all about doing. It's not something you study. You're not necessarily going to learn to be an entrepreneur from any other experience except building businesses. And whether you know it or not, I think there are two things you can do to set yourself up for success. And one is to have the right mentality and mindset about going and figuring out, identifying a problem, and then figuring out the solution to that problem and seeing if you can build a business that's profitable around solving that problem. And you might not know anything, but if you are good at talking to that prospective customer, understanding what's in their head, and giving them a solution that they then validate and are willing to pay for, or some other party is willing to pay for in whatever business you create, well then, I mean, that's all it really is. And so you don't need to go work at some company to figure that out. You might as well do that. Now, on the other side, secondarily, you can set yourself up for success, not just with these frameworks and this mindset, but also with surrounding yourself with people who fill your gaps. And some of that may be co-founders in your business, people you work with. It could be staff. It could be advisors. You're not. Nobody really knows everything and can figure everything out. The smartest people are able to get other people that are smarter than them, passionate about their idea, and willing to be part of it.
How have you surrounded yourself with bloodhounds and really ensured that you're around people who can sniff out salesman jargon from a very good idea that has legs?
Josh, I think part of it is trial and error. And people have said it many which ways, but one of the ways people have referred to your partners in a business, or it's almost like a spouse. And it really is that important of a decision. And I have been in situations where I worked with someone who worked with partners in multiple ventures that we didn't have that basis of trust and understanding and knowing each other. And it's so hard to create a business in that. And so I wouldn't necessarily recommend going about starting a business with someone you don't know in some capacity. It's very hard to do that. Some get lucky, but they're typically, there's got to be a bit of a basis, or, it could be that you met each other, you let this idea marinate over time, and eventually it can turn into something. But if it's just like, hey, I meet you day one, let's get together and do this business I have together, it can be really, really difficult, because there are different levels of commitment, and you're just not necessarily familiar with what their strengths and weaknesses are, how they act under pressure. And so if you can work with someone who you already know that, or if you can work with someone who has a track record of success, then that works too. And so, for me, the people that I do business with, or, that I start businesses with, do ventures with, it tends to be a smaller group of people that I have some experience with previously. And I know that we have different skill sets that complement each other, but that we have a similar mindset about how we go about solving a problem and building a business, and that, they have a certain level of success. And, if you can get access to someone who's maybe more successful and more experienced than you, but you're able to fill each other's gaps, that's great. Otherwise, you kind of got to figure it out as you go along.
I completely agree, and I really want to highlight the level of thought that you put into deciding how to make a team before even deciding to run with the idea. Investors would rather have a team working on the B idea than a B team working on the A idea. And so I'm interested in this next question. What's your opinion on college startup accelerators, and do you think they provide worthwhile resources, or do they just bias founders' decision-making too much? Or is it somewhere in between?
Geez, I think the answer is it depends. I don't. It depends on who is leading that accelerator and what their focus may be. You want someone who has real-world experience, not academic experience, or not someone who's, just a graduate themselves, but someone who has actual experience. And maybe the people that are running it may not have that directly, but if they can get a community of mentors that fill that in, then that's what you need. And so you want people who have done it before, but you definitely want multiple opinions, because people are going to look at the same situation differently. And it's good to get as well-rounded of a look at something in making key decisions, as opposed to just sticking to one person's opinion or just sticking to your own.
I completely agree. It's I forget where this comes from, but I think it's referred to as 360-degree analysis, trying to fill in all the blind spots so you don't just walk off a cliff with your business.
That's right. And I'll tell you, I've run businesses solo, and some people like it, some people are good with it. It just didn't suit me very well. Like even just the concept of going into the office and being by myself all day. I'm kind of a social person, and so that's just difficult. And I think that there are different blind spots that you have when you're all by yourself. And so if you're doing it by yourself, that's great, and I think that may suit different people, especially if someone is a perfectionist and always wants something to be done their way. It can be very difficult to work with someone else, but you need to make sure to have that group of advisors who can help you, who can answer those things that you may not know the answer to, or help show you a different angle that would typically happen in a dynamic with multiple business owners.
I see. And I think something I missed as a student entrepreneur that I'm starting to understand just by talking to you is that the emphasis on action, and how instead of wondering, sitting in your room and pondering, you went out and tried to start businesses both on your own and in teams, and just garnered real world data to understand which one suited you better. And that kind of segues. What is your biggest regret from college? What would you do differently if you had to redo?
I should knock on wood saying this, but I don't actually regret anything specifically. I think that I got a lot out of what I did. In particular, I actually was really involved in a lot of extracurricular activities and leadership within them outside of school, and I think I got more out of that than I did with the things that I did in the classroom. But I was very focused on getting a job at a big company name and sort of that typical path. And if I could have gone back, I would have surrounded myself with. It's not like I would have cast that aside, but I would have also developed relationships with people who were like-minded around entrepreneurship. And unfortunately, when I was in school, it wasn't as big of a focus. It wasn't as big of a thing. It wasn't as developed. There weren't these accelerators. There weren't these investment funds for students or alumni of different schools. And so, but it would have been good to be able to get that experience sooner. And when I look at it, to go back to that point I made when you were asking the questions about being an entrepreneur younger versus older, I mean, when you're a student, you have less risk, and you typically have a little bit more time and more flexibility. You have less responsibility, both financially and otherwise, and so it's a great time to give it a test. But what I would encourage is while ultimately, in order to make a venture successful, you really are going to have to go all in on it. But it's not a bad idea to use different frameworks to test out and validate whether there is interest in those businesses, and do a few at once, and then figure out the one that seems to be the one that problem is big for that customer base, and they're willing to pay for that solution you're creating, and go with that. But it's better, I think, to do a few at once, figure out what's best, and go in on that instead of just say, this is the one, and I'm going to put everything into it at the beginning before you might realize down the line that it might actually be a profitable idea.
It's very interesting. And so do you feel that intuition plays a role in your entrepreneurial career at all? And if so, what kind of intuit do you think is the most important for an entrepreneur?
Of course it does. And even in the frameworks that I teach, the core basis is a hypothesis. And you sort of say, this is what I think, this is what I think the problem is. This is who I think the customer base is. This is what I think the business model will be. And that comes from your gut. But then ultimately you need to go find a systematic way to validate whether that's right or not. And so, but it still starts in your gut. And of course, there's going to be judgment calls at different times where the data may disagree with what you feel in your gut, and depending on your personality type and how you make decisions, you may give more weight to one over the other. It's definitely bound to happen.
Yeah. It is very much a seesaw, and just it will change day to day and decision by decision. To move on a little bit, I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about your experience with publishing via the traditional route, and if you were to make a third book, would you go the traditional route again, or would you do self-publishing at Amazon? Would you put it for free on a blog? What would you do if you were making a third book?
Yeah, definitely. So guys, there's a few things I can say. So just to sort of go a little bit further with what you were inferring, there are two ways to go about it. You can self-publish, which essentially all you pay someone else to help put together a book for you, and it can be varying amounts, right? And even big publishers like Simon & Schuster and others, they have platforms where you can pay them thousands of dollars, and then they will distribute it for you. They'll help with the editing and all of the stuff and everything. Yeah. And I mean, if you think about it, actually, not to go too much into the rabbit hole, but publishing has some similarities to venture capital, where a vast majority of their titles will lose money or break even, and a small number will just make them a ton and be those best sellers. And so, and the way that it works on the publishing side is they actually pay you typically a portion when you sign the agreement, and then the rest of it when you actually turn in a finished manuscript. And so in one model, in the self-publishing model, you often pay out of pocket, but you get a majority of the money back in each sale. But you're essentially on your own, and you got to do all the marketing yourself. You got to do everything. You got to build that from the ground up. Secondly, then in the second scenario, we're doing the traditional route. They give you money up front, and then you get a smaller portion, and you don't get paid anything until you've already reached that threshold in your royalties that match that advance, and then everything above that you get a percentage. And so that in of itself is a different model. I personally think that when you get a traditional publisher to be willing to publish you, that's a level of credibility that you can build. That's validation that someone else is willing to put that risk and that money up front. And so, whereas anybody can self-publish, and so there's just a level of validation in having to go through that process. But at the same time, while they do give you resources, they do a lot of that for you. You still need to put a lot into marketing as well. And so it's not like just magically you're going to get a bestseller because you got some publisher who's willing to publish your book.
That's not how it works. No. Right.
And really, whether you want to go the self-publishing route or the traditional route, the best thing you can do, and I've spoke to literary agents as I was going on my journey, and I have one that represents me still to today, but I had heard one talk about how it's really just about building your platform. So whatever and that's sort of a vague term, but ultimately it's your group of followers and people that are engaged in the topic that you're talking to them about. And you can use social media, you can use a blog, you can use a podcast like you're doing to be able to build that base. And any literary agent you work with that would then connect you with a publisher, any publisher would look at the size of that base, that platform. Because they would see that as a group of people they would actively want to market to who could potentially buy the book. And so, and that's, when you were writing novels, it's a totally different thing. You almost have to write all of it and have to have someone love it. Whereas with nonfiction, you build a book proposal, which essentially is a business plan for your book. And the most important part is the promotion section, and they care, 10% about how good of a writer you are, and 90% about how well it'll sell. And so it's all about how well it'll sell and building that platform and talking about a topic that they think there's a core group of people that would be interested in it.
What did you do in particular to promote your books? Because I know famous marketers like Tim Ferriss refused to do book tours and were very, very particular on the way they would build their following and market to that following. What was your thought process going in, and what did you end up executing with for those books?
Yeah, so I'll offer a thought that is valid for an author looking to sell a book, but also just any business owner, especially, or even an entrepreneur who's starting a new venture. When you are looking to sell something, you have two options. You can either build your own base of customers or potential customers or your own little network from the ground up, or you can find others who already have built those communities that are interested in the topic similar to yours. And so, let's say you are writing a book about food, a cookbook. Well, you could either start your own blog and build it up to however many people, and that takes a long time, or you could find food bloggers that already have tens of thousands of followers and find a way to get in front of them. And so that's ultimately what you want to do. I mean, when you do a book tour, it seems fine, but there's only a limited number of people that would come in that specific time period. Whereas if you are able to have a post with a community of very engaged people in the tens or hundreds of thousands, that is way better because you can reach anybody everywhere instead of who are at that one bookstore. And that's why when I was explaining it, I specifically said engaged following. Right?
Yeah.
Because like you're saying, you could have 50 million people who never pay attention, and that's not as good as 100,000 who hang on your every word.
I completely agree. What questions should people ask themselves before deciding to write a book?
Well, I mean, just like starting a business, you're going to have a passion for that topic and feel like you have something to say
Mhm.
or a new way to say it, or to say a certain message that may have been said to one group for another group, packaged in a different way. So you got to be passionate about it to be willing to put a pen to paper, so to speak, or fingers to the keyboard. But you're also just the whole process of following through and promoting a book. It's almost like half of the battle. And that was one thing I didn't understand going in was, I had thought that most of the work was just writing the book and then that was it. But there's just as much, if not more, work on the promotion side of it. So it's got to be something that you're willing to not only create, but then find a way to get that message out there, whether you're self-publishing or working with a publisher. Because publishers will have resources. I had an agency that they contracted that promoted the book, but that that's not everything. You gotta take it steps further.
Sounds like you approach it like a professional, where it's another hypothesis that you're going to test and iterate through, try to create a final product.
Yes, and I mean that's also that is a difference between, if we're talking writing, fiction and nonfiction. But there's still, even if it's fiction, I mean, it's, in some respects it still works a little bit, but there are different ways that you can go about engaging your group and giving them value. And at the core, that's really just like any business. That's all that it is. It just, in publishing, it has to do with purchasing a book and you getting a share of that as opposed to any other business. But a lot of people, speakers and consultants, will use a book as a way to communicate their message, as something to help them maybe give away in order to monetize other parts of their business. So there are different reasons to go about writing.
I feel like you start things with the end in mind, which I admire. I think a long-term view is essential to good decision making. What were the goals you had in mind when you set out to write these books? Was it just an experiment with a long tail end where you're like, I might sell 1 million, I might sell 100, and we'll just see what happens? Or did you have certain KPIs that you wanted to, key performance indicators that you wanted to hit going in?
Yeah, so in some respects I do what you're talking about, of having the end in mind. But I also I found that a lot of my experiences professionally aren't something that I specifically said, I am going to do this. This is going to be my full focus. It's going to play out like this. I tend to be open to opportunity. When one comes to me, I take advantage of it. I see the potential behind it. I evaluate it, and then I just go. And I think that has opened me up to do a variety of things I never could have thought of. I look at even some of the businesses that I've been part of. I mean, from the first one I ever did was custom wedding invitations. To business, cool. to mobile apps, to beer pong tables, to real estate crowdfunding, to online marketplaces, to enterprise SaaS for real estate. I mean, those weren't all things I specifically intended to get into. I just saw opportunities and went from there. When we were looking at this topic of career transitions and otherwise, for the, really this can go for anybody, but in particular for the younger professional listeners, I would say that there's this mentality of the fact that in our mind we have to find a company and a business that we're passionate about. And that's very true of the millennial generation and Gen Z, where we want to be part of companies where we have aligned values and we see an importance behind that company's vision, and it's more than just making profit. But at the same time, I think what's important, especially earlier in your career, is to find transferable skills. And so it may not be your absolute ideal business of everything you'd want to do, but if you can gain certain skills, working for another company or otherwise, I think that can be incredibly valuable. For me, as an example, I realized that whether I'm running my own business or working at a large company, no matter what function it is, from marketing and sales or operation or engineering and whatever industry it may be, management was an important thing. And, it's important you're going to have to manage people and manage organizations if you're going to work your way up. And so that's why I went to work, in the company that I did at AT&T in a leadership development program where I got that management day one. And so even if it may not be the most ideal thing, if you can map out the different skills you need to be successful in the type of career you'd want to have and find those skills, that is better than being on this quest, and never finding that ideal. And if you build those skills along the way, then you have that opportunity to go create that ideal if you haven't been able to find it before then.
How did you go about mapping out your ideal skills? Did you have role models that you thought about and visualized, or did you just sit down with a pen and paper and start brainstorming? How did you go about that?
Yeah, so I a couple things. So mentors are great. I think Tony Robbins and others talk about how you go find those people who are great at what you want to do and go copy how they went about doing it. And I think there's some validity to that type of thought process. I had my own sort of way of going about doing it, but I think that one thing that is very good actually at helping, and I didn't find this till after the fact, just because it's a book that I think came out in the last couple of years, but it's by Bill Burnett and Dave Evans. It's called Designing Your Life. Mm-hmm. And I think it's based on a Stanford course, actually.
Yep.
But it offers a really interesting way to go about finding your career instead of just looking at what's online and saying like, oh, I like that or I like that. Mm-hmm. Being able to think through the things that get you excited, the things that you're very good at. They use the concept of flow, but the types of activities where you're actually, hours could go by and you're not even realizing it because you're so engaged and focused and enjoying what you're doing. And so finding a way, they talk in depth about things you can do in that book, and that would be part of a longer conversation. But I think that type of mentality can be very powerful of sort of changing the traditional search for things, not necessarily just to look at what's posted online and available, but talk to people who are doing the type of things that your skill set and interests do. And eventually, if you do that enough and network in those spaces, opportunities will come about.
And a big takeaway everybody should know about from that is just the idea that you could live more than one good life. I think that was one of my biggest takeaways. There's more than one life plan that would lead to good living. I don't know if that was one of the takeaways you had from that book, Professor.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the baby boomer generation, I think they talk about how most of them over the 40 plus years they work will have 5 different main big career transitions, and it was probably going to be even more for us younger generation people. And so, I think it's and that's actually echoes what I was talking about these transferable skills, because if you're going to be making all these changes, any skill set you can get will help when you do that. And the best way to get that skill set is by experience, and the best way to get that experience is just by going out and doing it.
Yeah, and that's actually something I'm wondering now is why, in your opinion, it seems like you've thought about this a lot. Why is it that our generation is going to be a lot more mobile? I agree with you. I think it will be, but I'm wondering what factors have changed from the baby boomer generation to us millennials that's caused this profound, I guess, career agility, ability to just move laterally.
Yeah, so I think there are a few factors. On one side, I think that us as younger generations have seen that often companies are not particularly loyal to their employee base. They care about profits and shareholders and things. And so we've seen with our parents' generation how companies and when our parents are loyal to certain companies, it doesn't necessarily serve them the best because it's about profit, not just about their people. And so I think we've witnessed that. We also witnessed how, in a short period of time, our parents' generation lost significant amounts of their retirement 10 years ago when the market crashed, and people who thought they were going to retire all of a sudden have to work for 5 or 10 more years. So there's a lot of that. I also think one thing in particular that I talk about when I talk to groups of executives about millennials and those of the younger generations is, and to groups of those young professionals as well, is that we have this sense of impatience because we're used to instant gratification from technology. Where if we want to know something, we can pull out our phone and get it in seconds. If we want to communicate with someone, there are so many different platforms to reach them, social media or otherwise. But then there's also this sense of entitlement that we typically have because a lot of us were recognized for everything growing up. We're like, everyone got the participation trophy. I remember getting certificates. Yeah, exactly. I remember getting certificates for having good attendance at school, like being recognized just for showing up. And so the problem is when those two things mix together, is it creates this lack of resilience. So we go, I deserve this, I deserve this because I'm entitled. Two, I should get it right now because I'm impatient. And when an obstacle comes up, we go, hey, there are a lot of other opportunities in this world. I'm just going to move on to the next. Yeah. And what anybody who's successful will tell you is that your level of success in business, in the professional world, and I think actually just in life, is directly proportional to the amount of resilience you have.
I agree.
Because those that are successful doing great things have to overcome obstacles. And if every time you see an obstacle, you decide, hey, I'm just going to give up, there are a lot of other opportunities. I mean, you may not think in your mind, oh, I'm going to give up. But you may think in your mind, oh, there are other things. And essentially you do give up. You're missing out on building that muscle.
I have my own little analogy for it. I do martial arts. And I like watching analyses, breakdown videos of fights. And I think this is Joe Rogan talking about a fight. And he just said, he just needs to bite down on the mouthpiece. And it made no sense. It's like, why would you bite down your mouthpiece and just get hit? But apparently the strategy was to get hit in the face and then knock the guy out. And so now whenever I get that significant adversity, I'm just like, okay, just bite down on the mouthpiece. You get a hit and then hit life back kind of thing. I agree with that. One last thing that you mentioned briefly before that interested me. You talked about information overload and instant gratification. You're a very productive individual. What do you do in your life to make sure, one, you have access to the right information, and two, that you're not overwhelmed with all the information that's out there in the world?
So one, limit the amount of information you take in. I mean, if you're reading news all day, you don't really have time to think. And ultimately you can fall prey to whatever the intentions of that source is. I remember a number of years back, I read a book called The Contrarian's Guide to Leadership by at the time he was one of the president of USC, University of Southern California, Stephen Samples, I think was his name. And he basically talked about this concept of two things. One, thinking gray. So not having to have an opinion about everything, because it takes brain power to make decisions about that. This is good and this is bad. And so I tend to hold off on categorizing the world in black and white and just allow things until I'm forced to make a decision about something. I don't waste my brain power on it. Secondly, one thing he did, and I haven't necessarily done this experiment directly, but in some respects I have, and I see the benefit of it, was he used to be a big consumer of news, and he, for a 6-month period, stopped. Didn't watch any news, didn't listen to the radio, didn't read a newspaper, and he just waited for news to come to him. And basically, if something was that important, someone else in his network would tell him about it. And then he would know the source it was coming from. And he would know their implicit biases, and he would be able to then take that situation, put it in the right clarity, change it away, and be able to understand the core of it. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, especially with all the fake news and other things out there and the social media bubbles we live in that just perpetuate these divides we have. And so consume less and find filters, I guess.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today, Professor. And I hope you have a wonderful Memorial Day weekend.
You as well. Thanks. It's been an honor.
There you have it. Thank you so much for listening to my podcast this week. You can subscribe at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. And while you're there, feel free to give me a review or feedback. You can also hit me up at lazarspodcast.com/contact. Cheers.